The envelope was cream-colored, heavy stock, the kind that whispers money before you even break the seal. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in March, forwarded from my old Boston address to my studio in Portland, Maine. Inside was a single card, embossed with gold lettering that caught the late winter light streaming through my windows. You are cordially invited to witness the marriage of Sienna Blackwell to Christopher Hale. My sister's wedding. June 15th. The Breakers, Newport. Black tie. What the invitation didn't say, what it carefully omitted in all that elegant calligraphy, was that I'd already been told, 3 months earlier, in a phone call that lasted exactly 4 minutes, that my presence would be inappropriate given the circumstances. The circumstances being that I existed. That I'd built a successful career. That I'd published a book of landscape photography that had, unexpectedly, become something people actually bought. That I'd been interviewed on NPR about capturing the changing seasons of coastal Maine. That I'd been invited to speak at galleries and workshops. That I'd been seen. My mother's exact words had been, "Sienna needs this day to be about her. Your visibility lately has been difficult for her. We think it's best if you sit this one out." I'd held that cream-colored invitation for 19 minutes, studying the careful wording, the family names listed with such precision, the RSVP card that would never be returned because I'd never actually been meant to receive this. Someone had sent it anyway. A cousin, perhaps. Or an aunt who didn't know the full story. Or maybe Sienna herself, in some complicated gesture I'd spend years trying to decode. But standing there in my studio, surrounded by prints of Atlantic storms and rocky coastlines and the kind of light that only exists at 4 in the morning when most people are still asleep, I understood something with perfect clarity. This wasn't an invitation. It was evidence. Proof of exclusion. Documentation of a pattern 32 years in the making. I placed it face down on my desk and opened my laptop. Then I did something I'd been avoiding for 3 months, something that felt both reckless and inevitable. I booked a ticket to Iceland. Not for my sister's wedding weekend. For 3 weeks earlier. For the summer solstice, when the sun never really sets and the light turns everything into something otherworldly. I didn't tell anyone. Not my mother, not my father, not Sienna. I simply began planning the trip that would finally prove what I'd always suspected, that my absence changed nothing, and my presence was never required anyway. My name is Thea Blackwell. I'm 32 years old. And this is the story of how I learned that the opposite of being seen isn't being invisible, it's choosing when to disappear. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why that invitation felt like a grenade disguised as good stationery, you need to understand how I became the daughter my family wished would simply take up less space. It started, as these things often do, with something small. I was 7, Sienna was 5. We were at my grandmother's house in Bar Harbor for Thanksgiving, and I'd spent the morning photographing the harbor with the disposable camera my uncle had given me for my birthday. Nothing sophisticated, just a child's fascination with how light moved across water. At dinner, I'd been excited to tell everyone about the photographs, about the way the morning fog had made the boats look like they were floating in air. But before I could finish my second sentence, Sienna had knocked over her juice glass. Red liquid spread across my grandmother's white tablecloth like blood, and suddenly the entire room was focused on her, the cleanup, the reassurance that accidents happen, the attention that transforms even misbehavior into a kind of performance. I'd watched as my parents fussed over her, as my grandmother rushed to get towels, as my uncle declared that juice was tricky and nobody should feel bad. And I'd understood, in the way children understand things they can't yet articulate, that Sienna's mistakes got more attention than my achievements. The pattern reinforced itself over years. When I won the middle school science fair with a project on tidal patterns, Sienna was struggling with math. "Let's not make a big deal about it," my mother had said when I'd shown her the blue ribbon. "Your sister is already feeling sensitive about her grades." When I got into a prestigious summer photography program at age 15, Sienna was dealing with a painful breakup. "Maybe we shouldn't mention it at dinner," my father had suggested. "She's going through a hard time." When I received a full scholarship to the Rhode Island School of Design, Sienna was applying to colleges and worried she wouldn't get into her first choice. My parents had celebrated quietly, in private, as if my success were something shameful that needed to be hidden. By the time I was 25 and had my first gallery showing in Portland, I'd learned to announce my achievements in whispers, if at all. Sienna, meanwhile, had married and divorced, started and abandoned 3 different careers, and moved back home twice, each crisis met with immediate family mobilization, emergency phone trees, and the kind of unconditional support I'd spent my whole life trying to earn through accomplishment. I wasn't jealous of her struggles. What I envied was the attention they generated, the way the family orbit shifted to accommodate her every need while I was expected to be fine, capable, self-sufficient. The strong one. The one who didn't need them. What they didn't understand, what they never understood, was that needing them and being denied was far more painful than never being allowed to need them at all. The call about the wedding came in December, 3 days before Christmas. I'd been in my studio editing photographs from a November storm that had battered the coast, creating the kind of dramatic light that made everything look both violent and beautiful. My phone rang, my mother's name appearing on the screen, and I'd answered with genuine warmth. Despite everything, I still wanted them to see me. Thea. My mother's voice was clipped, efficient. I need to talk to you about something sensitive. I'd set down my editing pen, my attention shifting entirely to the call. Is everything okay? Everything's fine. Sienna and Christopher are getting married in June. At the Breakers. The Breakers. Where my parents had been married. Where my grandmother had been married. The family venue, steeped in tradition and old money and the kind of aspirational elegance that had always felt slightly performative to me. That's wonderful, I'd said, meaning it. I'm happy for her. Yes. Well. A pause. The thing is, Thea, we need to talk about your role in the wedding. My role. I'd felt something tighten in my chest, recognizing that particular tone. Sienna's been struggling with some feelings lately, my mother continued. Your book has been very successful, and we're proud of you, of course, but... But what? But it's made things difficult for Sienna. She's been feeling overshadowed. And with the wedding being such an important day for her, we think it might be best if you gave her some space. Space. As if my existence took up room that could be better allocated to my sister. What does give her space mean? I'd asked, though I already knew. We think you shouldn't come to the wedding. Just this once, let Sienna have the spotlight without competition. The words had landed like stones. Not sharp, not cutting, just heavy, undeniable, sinking. I'm not competing with her, I'd said quietly. I've never competed with her. You published a book, Thea. You've been on the radio. You're giving talks. Can't you see how that might make your sister feel inadequate? So I should make myself small to make her feel big? Don't be dramatic. We're asking you to be considerate. One day. That's all. One day that represented every day of my 32 years. Every achievement downplayed, every success hidden, every moment of pride swallowed to avoid making Sienna feel less than. I need to think about this, I'd said, my voice strange and distant. There's nothing to think about. This is what family does. We support each other. Support. As if erasure were love. As if absence were generosity. I'd ended the call without agreement, but over the following weeks, the message was reinforced. My father called with the same request, framed as logical and kind. Sienna sent a text, brief, emotionless, saying she hoped I'd understand. My Aunt Margot, my mother's sister, left a voicemail explaining that sometimes the kindest thing we can do is step back. The family narrative had been established. Thea's success was Sienna's crisis, and the appropriate response was for me to disappear. I spent January and February in a strange limbo. My work continued. I had commissions, exhibitions, workshops to teach. But underneath the productivity was a growing anger, cold and sharp, that I didn't quite know what to do with. Then, in early March, that cream-colored invitation arrived. And everything crystallized. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and began researching. Not wedding venues or family therapists or ways to repair what was fundamentally broken. I researched Iceland. Specifically, the summer solstice in Iceland, when the sun barely dips below the horizon and photographers travel from around the world to capture the supernatural quality of light that exists nowhere else on Earth. I'd been accepted into a prestigious photography collective 3 years earlier, right before my book was published. They hosted an annual retreat in Reykjavik every June, a week-long intensive where photographers workshopped their projects and collaborated on new work. I'd never attended because it was expensive, and I'd always felt guilty about spending money on myself when my family so frequently needed financial help. Sienna's wedding was June 15th. The Iceland retreat ran from June 8th through June 22nd. I booked my flight that night. One way to Reykjavik, departing June 6th. Then I did something that felt both petty and essential. I documented everything. Not dramatically, not with malice, but with the precision of someone who'd spent their career capturing truth through images. I saved every text message about the wedding. I documented every phone call in a journal, date, time, exact wording. I compiled photographs spanning decades, showing a pattern of exclusion so consistent it was almost artistic in its execution. Family portraits where I was positioned at the edge, always ready to be cropped out. Holiday cards that somehow forgot to include me. Birthday celebrations where mine were quiet dinners while Sienna's were elaborate parties. I wasn't planning revenge. Not consciously. But I was building evidence, proof of a pattern I'd spent 32 years making excuses for. In April, my mother called again. Sienna's been asking if you're respecting her wishes, she said without greeting. I haven't been in contact with her, I replied, which was true. I'd responded to exactly none of the family communications about the wedding. She needs to know you're not planning to make an appearance. To cause drama. The accusation hung between us. As if my presence, my mere existence, were inherently dramatic. I won't be at the wedding, I said, the words easier than I'd expected. Relief flooded my mother's voice. Thank you. This means so much to Sienna. She'll be so grateful. Grateful for my absence. For my erasure. For my cooperation in the narrative that I was too much, too visible, too successful for the family's comfort. There's something else, my mother continued. We're asking that you stay off social media during the wedding weekend. No posts, no photos, nothing that might draw attention away from Sienna's day. This was new. Not just exclusion from the event, but silencing during it. You want me to be quiet while you celebrate without me. Don't make this about you, Thea. Can't you just once think about someone else's feelings? But I had been thinking about someone else's feelings. For 32 years. Every accomplishment muted, every success hidden, every moment of joy measured against whether it might upset my sister. I'll think about it, I said, and ended the call. May arrived with a kind of weather that makes coastal Maine almost unbearable. Cold rain, gray skies, wind that cut through even the warmest jacket. I spent most of the month in my studio, preparing for Iceland. Not just packing or planning logistics, but preparing myself mentally for what I was about to do. Because I'd realized something crucial. They wanted my absence. They wanted me to disappear quietly, to make myself small one more time, to prove that their comfort mattered more than my presence. But what if I didn't disappear? What if I simply went somewhere so beautiful, so remote, so utterly separate from their celebration that my absence wasn't a gift to them but a choice for myself? What if I didn't hide, I just lived visibly somewhere else? I began planning in earnest. The photography retreat. The glaciers I wanted to photograph. The waterfalls and black sand beaches and geothermal pools where light behaved like magic. The midnight sun that would illuminate everything in gold and amber, creating the kind of images that took breath away. I didn't tell my family about Iceland. When my father called to confirm I'd be respectful during the wedding weekend, I simply said I'd be unavailable. When my Aunt Margot texted asking if I was okay with everything, I replied that I was at peace with my choices. Which was true. For the first time in years, I felt clear about what I was doing and why. 2 weeks before my flight, I received a package. Inside was a framed photograph, my parents' wedding portrait from 35 years ago. A note from my mother read, "This is what family looks like. Someday you'll understand." I studied the image. My mother in white lace, my father in a tuxedo, both of them young and radiant, framed by the breaker's architecture. A perfect moment, carefully staged. What they didn't understand was that I'd spent my career photographing the moments between the poses, the unguarded glances, the real emotions, the truth that existed when people stopped performing. Their version of family was all performance. Mine was something else entirely. June 6th arrived with brilliant sunshine, unusual for Maine in early summer. I packed my cameras, my warmest clothes, and a journal where I'd been documenting everything, not for publication or sharing, but as evidence for myself that this pattern was real, that I wasn't imagining the decades of diminishment. My flight left from Boston at 6 p.m. I drove down the coast in the afternoon, windows down, letting the salt air clear my mind. At Logan Airport, I checked my phone one final time. 17 messages from my mother. 6 from my father. 3 from Sienna. Dozens from extended family members who'd apparently been mobilized to convince me to do the right thing and be there for my sister. I read none of them in detail. Instead, I turned off my phone, checked my bags, and walked through security toward a gate that would take me as far from Newport, Rhode Island as I could reasonably get. The flight was long, Boston to Reykjavik with a layover in Iceland. I slept fitfully, dreaming of light and water and families who celebrated instead of diminished. When I landed in Iceland at 7 a.m. on June 7th, the sun was already high and brilliant. I collected my rental car and drove east toward the retreat location, a converted farmhouse overlooking the North Atlantic. The landscape was otherworldly: volcanic rock, moss-covered lava fields, mountains that rose like jagged teeth against an impossibly blue sky. Everything looked simultaneously ancient and newly formed, as if the earth were still deciding what it wanted to be. I felt the same way. 32 years of being one version of myself, and now, suddenly, the possibility of becoming something else. The photography retreat began that evening with introductions around a dinner table. 12 photographers from 7 countries, all of us drawn to Iceland for the same reason: the light. The way it transformed ordinary landscapes into something transcendent. "I'm Thea," I said when my turn came. "I photograph coastal landscapes in Maine. I'm here to learn how light works when it never really leaves." Simple. True. No mention of family or weddings or the elaborate celebration happening 3,000 miles away, from which I'd been systematically excluded. Over the following days, I photographed obsessively. Waterfalls at midnight where the sun turned water into liquid gold. Black sand beaches where waves crashed against volcanic rock. Glaciers that glowed blue and ancient, existing outside normal time. The other photographers were generous, skilled, uninterested in anything except the work. We critiqued each other's images with honesty and respect. We stayed up until 3 in the morning talking about composition and light and what it meant to capture something true. Nobody asked about my family. Nobody needed me to be small. On June 15th, my sister's wedding day, I woke at 4 in the morning and drove to a glacier lagoon where icebergs floated like sculptures in water, so still it perfectly reflected the sky. The light was extraordinary, soft and golden and endless. I photographed for hours, my camera capturing images that felt like prayers. Not for my family, not in defiance or anger, but simply as documentation of being present in my own life without permission or apology. Around noon Iceland time, when Sienna would be walking down the aisle at the breakers, I was standing on a black sand beach, my feet in the freezing Atlantic, photographing waves that had traveled thousands of miles to break against volcanic rock. I posted a single image to Instagram. Not to be cruel or provocative, but because I'd built an audience that appreciated my work, and this image was among the best I'd ever captured. The composition was perfect: foreground detail, leading lines, the kind of light that existed nowhere else on Earth. The caption was simple: "Midnight sun, Reynifjara Beach. Sometimes you travel far to see clearly." I didn't mention the wedding. Didn't reference family or exclusion or anything except the truth of where I was and what I was witnessing. Then I turned off my phone and returned to photographing. I didn't check social media for 3 days. The retreat schedule was intensive: early morning shoots, afternoon critiques, evening workshops. I was exhausted and energized in equal measure, creating work that felt different from anything I'd done before. On June 18th, during a rare break, I finally turned on my phone. 847 notifications. My Instagram post had gone viral. Not just viral in the way photographer posts sometimes circulate within the industry. Viral in the way that meant non-photographers were sharing it, commenting, asking questions. Many of the comments were about the image itself, the composition, the light, the sheer beauty of the location. But others were reading between the lines. Posted during her sister's wedding while she was uninvited. Legend. Choosing yourself over family trauma. This is it. The light in this image is what freedom looks like. I scrolled further. Someone had done research, pieced together the timeline for my previous posts and public information. They discovered that my sister's wedding was happening the same day I posted from Iceland. The narrative had formed without my input. Talented photographer excluded from family wedding creates masterpiece instead. It wasn't quite accurate. I hadn't created the image in defiance, just in honesty. But I couldn't control how people interpreted it. What surprised me were the messages from other photographers. People sharing their own stories of family expectations and artistic sacrifice. People thanking me for choosing my work, my vision, my light. And then there were the messages from my family. My mother, how could you do this to Sienna? On her wedding day. My father, this is unforgivable. We asked for one thing. Sienna, you couldn't even let me have one day. You're selfish and cruel, and I never want to see you again. I read them all, sitting in the Icelandic midnight sun, feeling something close to peace. Because the thing they still didn't understand was that I hadn't done anything to them. I'd done something for myself. I'd chosen to be present in my own extraordinary life instead of absent from theirs. The retreat ended on June 22nd. I extended my stay in Iceland for another week, traveling solo through the highlands, photographing landscapes that looked like other planets. The viral post continued spreading. News outlets picked it up, not as scandal but as human interest. Photographer chooses art over family drama. Woman finds light in Iceland instead of sitting in shadows at home. Interview requests poured in. Gallery inquiries. A literary agent who'd seen the post reached out about a second book. The attention was overwhelming and slightly uncomfortable, but underneath it was something undeniable. Validation that my work mattered, that my vision had value, that I didn't need family permission to take up space in the world. When I finally returned to Portland in early July, my studio was exactly as I'd left it. But I was different. Clearer. Stronger in ways I couldn't have articulated. My family maintained radio silence. No calls, no texts, nothing. Which was fine. I'd spent 32 years begging for their attention. Now I was discovering what it felt like to exist without needing it. 3 months later, in September, I received an email from Sienna. Subject line, "We need to talk." I almost deleted it without reading. Almost. But curiosity won. Thea. Mom and Dad think I shouldn't contact you. But I need you to know something. My wedding was beautiful. Everything I'd wanted. But when I look at the professional photos, something's wrong. They're technically perfect but lifeless. The photographer captured poses, not moments. Nothing real. I've looked at your Iceland photos 100 times. The light in them is what I thought my wedding would have. Joy. Freedom. Truth. I don't know how to apologize for what we did. For what I did. I'm not even sure you want my apology. But I need you to know that excluding you didn't make my day better. It just made it smaller. I read the email 3 times. Then I saved it in a folder and didn't respond. Not because I was being cruel. But because some apologies come too late, and some relationships can't be repaired by acknowledging what was broken. A year after Iceland, my second book was published. Light at the Edges explored what happens when you move away from centers, family, expectations, traditional paths, and discover what exists in the margins. The book included my Iceland images, yes, but also earlier work I'd been hiding, photographs of Maine I'd taken at 4 in the morning when everyone else was sleeping. Storm documentation from weekends when my family was gathering without me. Images created in solitude that were more honest than anything I'd made seeking their approval. The book launch was in Portland, at a gallery I'd dreamed of showing in since I was 20. The room filled with fellow photographers, former students, collectors, and people who'd followed my journey online. My family wasn't invited. Not as punishment or revenge, but as boundary. They taught me that my presence was conditional, something to be managed and controlled. I'd learned the lesson well. Their presence in my life was now conditional too. Near the end of the evening, a young photographer approached me. She couldn't have been more than 22, nervous and eager. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "I was supposed to skip a major exhibition because my parents wanted me at a family reunion. Your Iceland post made me realize I could choose differently." "Did you go to the exhibition?" I asked. "Yes. And it changed my career. Led to representation, commissions, everything." I pulled her into a hug, this stranger who'd learned the same lesson I'd spent 32 years figuring out. Later, standing alone in the gallery after everyone had left, I looked at my photographs lining the walls. Evidence of a life lived fully, without permission, without apology. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother, her first contact in over a year. "We saw the review in the New York Times. Congratulations." I read it twice. Then, without responding, I turned off my phone and drove home through the late September darkness, my car filled with the smell of salt air and the satisfaction of having chosen myself, finally, completely. Some endings aren't dramatic. There's no final confrontation, no cathartic showdown where everyone says what they mean and relationships are either repaired or definitively destroyed. Sometimes estrangement is just quieter. A gradual recognition that the people who raised you will never see you the way you need to be seen. That their love, such as it is, requires you to be smaller than you are. And sometimes the kindest thing, not for them but for yourself, is to simply live your life at full brightness elsewhere. 2 years after Iceland, I still live in Portland. I still photograph the Maine coast, though now I travel frequently, teaching workshops, giving talks, documenting landscapes that need the kind of attention I used to waste seeking from people who couldn't give it. I don't hate my family. I don't think about them much at all, which is perhaps the most honest measure of healing. Occasionally, I'll see social media posts from relatives. Sienna and Christopher had a baby. My parents renovated their house. Life continues in that separate orbit, and I feel neither pulled toward it nor pushed away from it. Just separate. The girl I was at 7, photographing boats in morning fog while my family fussed over spilled juice, would be amazed by this version of me. The one who books plane tickets to Iceland without asking permission. Who publishes books about light and margins and choosing yourself. Who teaches other photographers that their vision matters more than their family's comfort. I think she'd be proud. Last month, I returned to Iceland. Not for a retreat or assignment, but simply because I wanted to. I drove to that same black sand beach where I'd stood during Sienna's wedding, photographing waves that had traveled thousands of miles to break against volcanic rock. The light was different this time, autumn instead of summer, golden hour instead of midnight sun. But still extraordinary. Still worth documenting. I set up my camera, composed the shot, and waited for the perfect moment when light and water and rock aligned exactly right. And as I pressed the shutter, I thought, this is what family should have felt like. This attention, this care, this commitment to seeing clearly. The image I captured that day became the cover of my 3rd book. And when I looked at it later, printed large and hung in my studio, I could see everything I'd needed to learn, that sometimes the greatest act of love is choosing to be fully present in your own life, even, especially, when others want you absent from theirs. I never went back to another family wedding. Never reconciled with my parents or rebuilt what was broken with Sienna. But I did learn to take photographs that stopped people in their tracks. Images that made strangers cry and feel and remember why beauty matters. And every time someone looked at my work and said, "This is extraordinary," I heard what my family never said, "You are enough. Exactly as you are." Without dimming, without hiding, without permission. That was the revenge, if you can even call it that. Not hurting them, but healing myself. Not making them small, but finally standing at my full height. They wanted me invisible. I chose to be luminous instead.